All right, we're a little after 9 here, so we'll kick things off. I want to welcome everybody to the Ag Drainage and Future of Water Quality Conference. I'm Chuck Brandel with ISG, civil engineer. Thank you all for attending. I know, especially those of you in southern Minnesota, we've been dealing with a lot of rain and a lot of water and issues. But I'll start off with a few housekeeping items. We're in the Grand Hall here. We'll have breakout speakers after our first presentation. Those breakout sessions, if you go out the hall and up the stairs, there's signs. If you look at the agenda, it says which room each one of those is in. I want to thank our sponsors, which includes ISG, Blue Earth County, Faribault County SWCD, Heron Lake Watershed District, and Rinky Noonan. I also want to thank all of you that have volunteered to speak today. I hope that we have a good day. We have a large, diverse group and talk about the importance of ag drainage and water quality. With that, I'll introduce our first speaker, Mr. Brian Perry from the OLakes Sustain Program. We're very pleased to have him here. He's an account manager for the Central Region, and he's going to talk about industry views on drainage and water quality. So let's give a warm welcome to Brian.
Thanks, Chuck. Yep, thank you. How's everybody doing this morning? A little loud. Probably don't want to hear me that well, do you? Sounds like everybody's been impacted, seen a lot of storm damage driving up, and know you guys have been facing a kind of a tough spring and even more challenging June. So appreciate everybody coming today. Just wanted to, had been asked to speak here at this conference. Land O'Lakes has made some investments and in the Sustained Business Unit. I'll give you a little bit of background information of what Land O'Lakes Sustain is as we go throughout the presentation. Some of the water quality challenges that we're currently presented with in the U.S. and those sorts of things. So I cover a 4-state area, work with ag retailers, primarily in Iowa and Minnesota. It focused on nutrient stewardship and soil conservation and trying to make impacts locally to the field scale level to promote continuous improvement of those two primary categories. So just as we get started, kind of a state of the union of some of the water quality challenges. Anybody taking a look at that picture realize or know what that picture is an image of? Algae in a lake, that's correct. So this is the Western Lake Erie Basin. This picture is from 2014, August of 2014, and is one of the greater kind of water quality challenges that we face today in the U.S., along with Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia zone. A lot of challenges and a lot of different sources of where some of those impacts may be coming from. In coarse freshwater, phosphorus is our biggest challenge, and that's something that about August every year they start to see some dynamic of algae blooms starting to occur. This is the next picture of just what it looked like on the shore and the image that a lot of the general public starts to see. So on August 2nd of 2014, roughly 2 a.m. in the morning, the city of Toledo started seeing issues with the quality of the water. At that point, they decided no drinking of the city water was put into effect. As they went throughout the weekend, then those folks in the Toledo area, which was around 400,000 people, did not have a primary water source to either drink, bathe, cook, those sorts of things. By 10 a.m. on Monday morning, they flipped the switch back on and said everything was fine. But that in itself created a challenge of what can we do to make correctful impacts. And ultimately, there's a couple ways that we can go about doing those sorts of things. Director now that works for Land O'Lakes Sustain, Jason Weller, was chief of the NRCS during that time frame. He went in later that week and gave a presentation that Ohio farmers and Indiana farmers are doing a lot of really good things for water quality and trying to drive these impacts down. No regulation needed. And the next gentleman that came up said, don't listen to the federal people. We need to make regulations happen here and now. We've got to fix this problem locally. And those are the challenges that we start to face is when there's push comes to shove, there's things that the local governments have to do to make impacts. And that's the place where Land O'Lakes Sustain sees an opportunity and fit. That we are very much freedom to operate and don't want to see regulation, but we also know too that there's impacts like this that maybe there's opportunities to get better and discovering those things are a lot of times the challenges. Later that year, the State House in Ohio went ahead and passed a new law on those regulations, and today farmers in that region now face a phosphorus regulation where they can't apply commercial fertilizer, commercial phosphorus, or manure on frozen fields. They can't apply when the top 2 inches of the soil is saturated, and they can't apply when there's a 50% chance or better of a 1-inch rainfall. So those types of things make it really a challenge to freedom to operate in those types of places. But that's what really kind of society pushes the industry to do in those types of issues when we see those types of challenges. We also, of course, very locally here to you guys, see a lot of the buffer law issues come up. Wisconsin is looking at regulations on manure applications themselves, as well as one that is kind of hit really in this sector, right, is the Des Moines Waterworks Lawsuit and the potential for regulation of non-point source and drainage districts. And again, just kind of points the challenges that are faced some point down the line. How do we continue to promote to wider adoption of things that can make positive impacts? At the end of the day, too, we've got a consumer that maybe sees glimpses of things that steer them away from a certain food. A lot of organic, non-GMO, RBST-free, antibiotic-free type headlines out there today, and today's consumer clicks on those and reads a couple sentences, maybe a paragraph or two, and they move on and they make their assumption on what they should be doing and how they should be making their buying decisions on food and how they should be eating. And that's really kind of turned society a little bit, we feel, in terms of the consumer really not necessarily knowing what's right and what's healthy, what's good for me and what's not. Sustainability drivers, we think, are going to be a huge driver as we continue into the future. Today, this is a study that was done. 83% of consumers today consider sustainability when buying their food. 66 say it's important in their buying decisions that their food and drinks are produced in a sustainable way. And in fact, 58% change their food choices based off the environmental impacts that they think happen in that food. So this is the consumer really trying to decide, how they're making bets with their dollar and where they want to basically make those investments. And we think it's going to be a trend that continues large into the future. And why are we there today, and why is the consumer maybe more confused today or doesn't know how agriculture and how their food's produced? This statistic, I think, really boils down to that today. Back in 1912, 12.4 million farmers were in the U.S., roughly about a third of the U.S. population. Of course, as populations continue to grow and farm sizes continue to grow and we've got less farmers, today we've got 3.2 million farmers, and that's less than 2% of the population. In fact, if you look, 60 to 70% of the food that's produced in the U.S. is produced by less than 0.1% of the population. That dynamic in itself really points to the challenge that a lot of folks are, at least a generation or two removed from the farm and don't know, the practices that we do and why we do them. Even though we've got, a lot of things in mind, economics, profitability, and bottom line, we're producing that same food for our family as well. So why would we make decisions that would impact that negatively? But I think this statistic really points to the challenge, and really we've got a great story to tell. U.S. agriculture has got a tremendous story. When you look at some of the statistics behind this, from 1948, we've increased output per unit of input by 250%. We're getting much, much more efficient at producing food for the U.S., but also producing food for the world. One other statistic here too, this is a time frame from 1930 to 2010, we're producing 650% more corn on 13% fewer acres. So we've got a really, really good story to tell. Why don't we tell it? Because I think we don't make the investments as an ag sector to tell that story. And when you look at the ag sector, we've got hundreds of thousands of individual businesses that are all one or two people, correct? And it's challenging for those people to connect with the consumer, especially when the consumer is in large part outside of the geographies where their food is really grown. And at the end of the day, when we've got these types of stories to tell, that's why Land O'Lakes has made the investment and said, we need to stand up for the industry. We need to tout the things, the benefits, these types of stories that have been built over time. But we also need to tell the story that's happening right now and today, the investments that are being made on positive environmental impacts, positive water quality pieces. We've got to tell the consumer and we've got to tell society what we are doing versus the media continuing to grab bits and pieces of the challenges that we see from the environmental impacts, which are very they're stories that really at the end of the day the consumer wants to know what's going on. So as you guys may know, Land O'Lakes, a few of those logos and different pieces of our business are very evident to you guys and the consumer. Winfield United is of course our agronomy arm. Work with a lot of ag retailers and supplier of chemicals and fertilizers, seeds, those sorts of things. Purina brand is very well known. So we're in the animal nutrition and feed space. Today, Purina is broken out, in fact, into many different divisions. We just have the livestock sector, while the pet sector and those sorts of things that you may see too is owned by other companies. Of course, Land O'Lakes dairy and food are the butter, and the Indian Maiden is a very good brand, something that has been around for a very long time. And then here just roughly about a year and a half ago, our CEO at the time decided, you know what, we're facing a lot more challenges today, consumer pressure, those sorts of things. We've got to make an investment to be able to tell the story of what agriculture is doing and what we can change the consumer's view. He tells a story that basically 2 years ago we were very, very close to losing GMOs as an industry, and the ability of what the GMO story tells, and scientifically, the positive pieces that it brings to food production with reduced chemicals and those sorts of things, we about lost the GMO, just about lost GMOs as an industry, and would have changed our sector overnight. And that really opened up Chris Polzinski's eyes that we needed to make an investment to help the industry and help our sector, help our farmers and the folks that own us, tell the story correctly and tell it to a wider audience. So at that point in time, he created Land O'Lakes Sustain as a fourth business unit for Land O'Lakes. Why do we think we've got a good opportunity to educate the consumer at the end of the day? When you look at our businesses, we go from fork to fridge, from seed all the way through research and development of crop insights, have got a great animal nutrition presence with Purina feed. Of course, have got milk quality and processing of that milk, and then all the way down to branded goods with being on the shelf of a lot of grocers across the U.S. with our dairy food products. And at the same time, we're farmer-owned since 1921. I think from that perspective, me being a farmer myself, there's no better company that can tell this story other than one that we as farmers and local ag retailers own. So that's the interesting dynamic of why we think we've got a great opportunity to tell the story and educate the consumer, and those sorts of things are what we work on a daily basis. Just some numbers. When we look at what Land O'Lakes touches, today we touch roughly 25% of America's farmers. We also have a play on 30% of the animal protein that ends up on market or grocer shelves. 50% of the harvested acres roughly in the U.S., and we're in 90% of America's grocery retail outlets. With that's the presence that we have all the way through this chain, and feel we've got a great opportunity to tell that story. So what is Land O'Lakes Sustain? I'll go into that a little bit here, tell you who we're kind of working with, and then get into some water quality studies that a partner of ours, Iowa Soybean Association, has spent a lot of time on. But we look at advancing system-wide efforts that balance the economic well-being of family farms and the health of our shared environment, and we think that goes hand in hand. You can never say sustainability without economics, and that's in large part a lot of the things that we promote and talk, we feel have got a very good economic play locally on the field scale level. And if it doesn't, is it really sustainable? Do we need to take advantage of opportunities of public cost share to make positive impacts towards water quality and those sorts of things? We think that's critical as well. So Land O'Lakes Sustain is a farmer-owned precision conservation technology platform that drives, captures, and shares that continuous improvement story. At the same time, improvement of producer sustainability practice required to feed a hungry planet and care for the environment. And that's the thing that we always hear as an ag sector, is that we've got more and more mouths to feed as we continue into the future here. And locally, we've even got some challenges in terms of hunger, even though we've got a plentiful and cheap food supply. But at the end of the day, that's where it really comes down to it, guys, is we've got to capture data in order to create that story to go back to the consumer and tell them the impacts and changes that we're making over time, how that improves economics, how that improves profitability, and how it improves the environmental impacts that we'll talk about in some of the practices here moving forward. So conservation agronomy, we think we help farmers maximize the efficiency, reduce waste, putting fertilizer where it's needed, keeping soil in place, enhance profitability in those cases. Let's be economical with the types of applications that we do make with fertilizer, chemicals, those sorts of things, as well as variable rate seed. Increase resiliency of fields, being able to take on the challenging rainfalls that we we seem to get more often than what we ever have, and you guys are living that on a daily basis up here this year. Reduce risk, minimize off-farm impacts, and at the same time, long-term capacity to produce food for a growing world. Today, you'll see we're working with 29 ag retailers, which is a small drop compared to our network of ag retailers that we work with on the agronomy side, but we continue to grow that footprint. Every pin that you see there is an ag retail location that we work with, and locally here in Minnesota today working with Central Farm Service and New Way Co-op. So what do we ask growers to do? What are the tools that are in our toolbox to promote? And a lot of things that you guys see here on this list may be not new. It may be an area that you've heard about. It might be something that you're doing for the farmers in the room. Things as simple as split applications of nitrogen, where we know that we get better uptake and have potentially got less risk of that application, entering into tile water or runoff and ended up into a body of water. It might be utilizing cover crops. It might be utilizing a tool to make better nitrogen applications. A lot of these things, again, are not new to this industry and sector, but the rate of adoption is where the opportunity is. And when we see and hear that, in large part, about a third of the nitrogen that is applied in the U.S. is stabilized, we think that's a big opportunity, knowing that there's economic and environmental benefits to things like stabilizers to make improvements in water quality. So this is basically the playbook, and what we do is we'll sit down with the ag retailer. What are things that you guys offer today? What are new things that you want to offer, and how do we improve that rate of adoption in areas and get more awareness around some of these practices, whether it be strip till or no-till, cover crops, split applications of nitrogen, variable rate phosphorus and potassium. Those are all important things in our mind that, again, increase profitability and at the end of the day have got big impacts for economics and environment. So I'll step in a little bit to tile management and talk about a little bit some of the work that Iowa Soybean Association is doing, and we've got a partnership with them this year doing some water quality testing with an ag retailer in Iowa. At the end of the day, I think from our perspective, we must learn the positive and possible negative effects that tile may have on water quality, and there's both sides of that, and I think just understanding what's coming out our tiles is half the battle, and why we promote that this system that they've got in place has been very beneficial for understanding that. How do we increase that adoption and create more awareness? So this is all data from 2017. In 2017, ISA took 2,897 samples from 342 locations, and a location would be a tile outlet where they can go in and grab a water quality sample. Typically, they do that on a monthly basis or a bi-weekly basis, excuse me. So they catch glimpses over time, and obviously, that's not the perfect system, but it's the one that's scalable at this point in time. They capture the management information on that farm of what's the previous and current crops, what's tillage method, how much nitrogen was applied, the timing, the method, the source, were there any nitrogen stabilizers or inhibitors used, and then is there any conservation practices, edge of field management. So with all of that information, they're able to at least start to make some trends of what's happening. And this is not statistical data, folks, that there is a lot of variables that go into this, and I know we all know that in this room, but it at least gives us some trends of areas that may be providing higher or lower nitrates, and what are the things that we can do to change or improve or mitigate those risks. Average 2017 nitrate concentration across all of the samples that they took was 13.1 parts per million nitrate. If you guys recall, the safe water drinking standard and what the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit was pursuing and pushing was 10 parts per million. So anything above 10 parts per million, they've got to let consumers know, or they've got to clean up that water. Anything below that is okay. So that's just a little bit of a line in the sand, so you can draw some comparisons of what they found. Landform has got the potential to be a big impact and player within that, and this is a map of Iowa and the different landforms and where they had a great majority of the samples that came from. If you notice, the Des Moines lobe was the highest equivalent. Is that just sold the landform that's making that impact? Not sure, but at least it's a trend that it in large part had the highest nitrate concentration in 15 parts per million compared to northeast Iowa that was sitting at 11.3 and southern Iowa that was sitting at 11.0. This chart here is just looking directly at the impacts of rotation. Within the corn-on-corn systems, that's the very left bar you can see was higher than both of the others. The average there came out to be about 17.8 parts per million on the corn-on-corn environments that they tested. The corn on previous year's soybeans is the next chart. So corn on soybeans, and that came out at 12.3 parts per million nitrate, and then the last was soybeans on corn, came out at 11.4 parts per million. So all of them showed just a bit higher. Corn on corn showed a little bit higher than that case in terms of what was coming out the tile in their tests. The last chart here is all of the 2017 plots on a line and a trend drawn, both 2016 and 17, excuse me, in what rate of nitrogen was applied on that farm and how much nitrate was coming out of those locations. In large part, they said this isn't statistical, showing that rate had a big impact. You can obviously see for yourself that the lines do climb a little bit, but basically, if we go and shut off any nitrogen to any farms being applied, yields would obviously tank, but at the end of the day, we would still have a lot of nitrate coming out at the end of the tiles and could possibly be over that 10 parts per million. Just through mineralized nitrogen that comes from organic matter, we see a decent level of nitrate coming out just in those situations, but rate does have a little bit of an impact there as well. The next, looking at cover crop effects, they obviously don't have a lot of information from where we've got cover crop as a management practice within that, but enough to again make some trends. Both from the fields that did not have a cover crop, 651 samples were taken. And then on the flip side of that, 344 samples taken from fields that did have a cover crop. The difference was the advantage towards cover crops of 4.7 parts per million. So there was a 33% reduction on the fields that utilize cover crops as a tool to help mitigate some of that nitrate risk. So a lot of data that you see out there, 30 to 40, 50%. Depending on the growth and the season that we have. If we have a lot of mineralized nitrogen and really good growing season in the fall where we can get cover crops established, there's going to be probably a higher reduction level in some of those areas. But this was just 2017 information on the sites that they could steer both of those management practices out of. The next is edge of field practices, and I think this is where we've got a potentially great impact, and a lot of the data that we see out there promotes that edge of field practices, dollar for dollar spent, might be as impactful or even greater than what the in-field management practices can make. And of course, you know, you're treating or potentially treating more water in those cases versus trying to change a lot of different operations, management practices of when they're applying nitrogen, how they're applying nitrogen, those sorts of things. So a lot of value in the edge of field practices. Time of year definitely has effect on how well these work. You can kind of see the April and May bars are a little bit lower just in comparison to the June, July in most cases. And a lot of that being you've got to have a warm up and some good microbial activity to make some of those things work, like a wetland or a bioreactor or saturated buffer. So the more we get into summer, where maybe we aren't seeing quite the nitrates leaving the field, is when these work the best. So we're still kind of missing that April-May timeframe. What can we do that makes the most meaningful impact? You know, the edge of field practices might not be as impactful there. But what they saw, and this is a smaller subset of the data that they have, but bioreactors, they saw a 45% reduction in concentration of nitrate coming out of the tiles, and that's indicated by the blue lines. Saturated buffers, 58% reduction. That's represented by the green lines, and then the impoundments, wetlands, and those sorts of things, ponds, saw a 44% concentration reduction. So in large part, you can see, you know, some dramatic reductions being done. The challenge is the cost of these types of edge of field practices are a lot of times very expensive, might create some or need for some public influence and money to come into those. But if you look at the state nutrient reduction strategies for every state that's in the Mississippi River Basin, it leads to very much higher level adoption of bioreactors, saturated buffers, wetlands, ponds, those sorts of things, to the scale of, you know, thousands and thousands of these installed on a yearly basis in order to hit our nutrient reduction goals. And I think just as an industry, if we get there and if we have that much interest, the planning and the planning of those types of things is going to be dramatic, and companies like ISG are going to be very busy planning those out and structurally placing those types of systems. So, but show very good impact in terms of water quality. This all leads back to Iowa Soybean Association. That data that I just presented to you is given back to the grower, and then they're metriced according to others that are in the program, but it's always kept anonymous of those site-specific locations. This is kind of the flip side of that. This is an Iowa Water Quality Information site that has nitrate sensors all across the state of Iowa in different streams, rivers, those sorts of things. Some of these sensors, though, have even been put on the edge or on the end of a drainage district, and you know, are creating basically lifetime nitrate sensors. So you can go to this website. If you just Google Iowa Water Quality Information System, that'll take you to the website. You look for a nitrate tab within that website, and you can go and click on each of those dots live time, and it's giving hourly readings and reporting back to the website what's the nitrate level of the water that's going through or over that sensor at that particular point in time. So the awareness from both the public standpoint is growing, from a private standpoint is growing through partnerships and things like Iowa Soybean Association is doing. We've got to understand some of the impacts of, you know, what we're doing in you know, the practices, management, those sorts of things, and what you know, tile has allowed, you know, some of those the ability to capture those water quality samples. But then, you know, what can we do about it, and how do we start to mitigate that risk if we do have levels over the safe water drinking standard? So what's Land O'Lakes Sustain doing in areas like this then? how are we making impacts, and how are we creating awareness and education. I mentioned we've started a partnership with Iowa Soybean and looking for more partnerships where we can create some of those same types of levels of awareness of water quality coming out of tiles. But we also locally here, kind of in the state of Minnesota, not locally to Mankato, but over in the Austin area, we've got a partnership with the local ag retailer there on the Cedar River. We call it the Cedar River Watershed Partnership. We connected the ag retailer, in this case Central Farm Service, and its farmers with many of the partners that they more than likely probably wouldn't be connecting with. Very well could, but we think that just that partnership has allowed a lot more conversation and visibility. How can we bring more resources to our growers in those sorts of cases? So within that partnership is Mower County Soil and Water Conservation District. We've got a food company interested in that space, and that's, at the end of the day, we feel a huge impact, food companies, in terms of connecting them or connecting the farmer to the consumer through the food company. So Hormel is a partner there. Environmental Initiative is a nonprofit organization that really looks at the science behind of everything that we're doing locally at ag and says, yes, this works, and yes, there's environmental benefits that impact it. And our Environmental Initiative has been a great nonprofit to work with there, and then Minnesota Department of Ag as well. We're focusing on the buffer support services. That's an area that we saw a need for helping educate the grower of, with the buffer law, what are the things that we can do? How can we reduce the amount of buffer that's required by the state? And we've got a tool that looks at the topography of the ground and says, you know what, that doesn't make sense to have the buffer here. We can shave this in a little bit, but we may need to add a little bit more there. And what we found in large part is we're able to help take 20 to 40 to 50% of the amount of buffer that's not required, and that's approved by the state to basically reduce the amount of acres that go into the buffer just by having a detailed plan and knowing where water's flowing in. So focusing on buffer support services there in that watershed, adoption of economic and environmental practices that we talked about in the list that I showed you, and then Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program is a Minnesota state-specific certification program that gives the grower, mitigates risk of any new regulations coming. Any grower that signs up and becomes certified by the state does not have to meet new regulations for the next 10 years. So we see a lot of value in terms of that program as well. At the end of the day, we're engaging growers on those services with a high level of helping them find cost share that fits their operation and helps lead them to things that they wanted to do. One of those being in large part was strip till. A lot of interest in that region of strip till, but a high investment to make those changes from an equipment standpoint. How can we help get some cost share to mitigate those challenges in that switch? Again, a lot of the same things that you've seen this slide already, but a lot of the same things that we promote in that watershed and across the landscape with the retailers, the ag retailers that we're working with. A lot of the technologies, practices, and products are not new, but how do we continue to find higher levels of adoption of those sorts of things? So that is my presentation. I think just from the perspective of what Land O'Lakes Sustain stands for, and promoting the freedom to operate in today's current environment, we're very much an advocate of that. We do know that tile is very economical. In fact, it's the best dollar that's spent on a lot of acres, especially on a year like this, as you guys know, in this direct region. At the end of the day, we think U.S. has got an abundance of cheap food for the consumer when you look at it on a world consumer perspective, but yet we still have some local challenges with hunger. you know, at the end of the day, tile has some positive and potentially negative impacts towards water quality. And I think my takeaway, hopefully for everybody here today, is understanding what are those impacts. Are for whatever reason the tile that we place or the tile that we have on our farm or that we're placing for growers, is it going to have a higher concentration of nitrate for a reason that we can't identify? And if it does, what can we do to mitigate those risks and start making positive impacts versus, you know, continuing to hear and see challenges of, you know, potentially new regulations or lawsuits that come about. If we make positive impacts and if we're making some changes, agriculture's got a seat at the table. If we don't, that's where the challenges continue to come in, that if we don't have the ability to provide data back to those groups and say, we're making positive impacts, we are going to put ourselves a little bit up against the wall and not be able to respond to some of those regulations or those types of things as they come. So my contact information is up there, guys. Would be happy to answer any questions that anybody may have here this morning, but appreciate the time and speaking to everybody.
Hello. I had actually two questions. You had said 10 parts per million is the level on the nitrates. How does that equate to milligrams per liter?
Per liter?
Yeah.
That's the same equivalency. So milligrams per liter is the same as parts per million.
Thank you. I didn't know that. And then I understand cover crops as far as preventing erosion. You know, so if it's carrying ground off has nitrates and whatever in it, but how does the cover crop reduce nitrates out of a tile?
Yeah, so if you think at the end of the year, you know, depending on how good the growing season is, right? If you've got a good growing season and you've got a good high organic matter soil, generally you're seeing greater levels of mineralization, free nitrogen that comes from the organic matter in those types of environments that stays in the soil. The crop may or may not use that. We may, you know, not have as good a yield expectancy, you know, at the end of the year based off of what we started the year. So a nitrogen application rate, you know, might be a little bit over the economical rate. So we have just some extra free nitrogen that we applied that might be still in the soil. If we put in a cover crop, that essentially is just adding a living root, you know, to times that we don't have a living root in a you know, general row crop setting. So basically what a cover crop does is just goes and you know, grabs that free nitrate. The more growth that we can get, the better it does. But during the time of year that we see, you know, losses, especially kind of that early spring when, you know, we have a bare soil or a non-living root there, that's when cover crops capture that free nitrate in the soil and doesn't allow it to go any further down to leach into tile water. So big impacts in terms of, you know, what we generally see, but growth is very dependent on, you know, the ability for that cover crop to capture those nitrates. So, you know, as we push further north, becomes more of a challenge. Of course, you know, growers are pushing for yields in challenging, you know, economic environments. The way to push for yield in some cases is to have longer maturity crops. So, you know, it makes that window a little more challenging, but there's a lot of innovation that's going into cover crops. You know, how do we get them seeded earlier in the year before maybe the actual cash crop comes off. Yep.
Yeah, John Torbert with the Iowa Drainage District Association. I just wanted to comment briefly on the Waterworks lawsuit, with which we were intimately involved, of course. And the point you made in your presentation was that the main federal focus of the lawsuit was to regulate tile discharge. I think it's important that the audience understand that that was never litigated. The lawsuit was dismissed by the federal judge on 3 different grounds, but the major question raised by the lawsuit, and that is tile drainage covered by the Clean Water Act, never got to federal court. So that issue is still out there. I believe we would win that if we are challenged in court based on my reading of the regulation, but my point is we're not out of the woods yet.
That's a very good point, yes, and you know, I think that's the way that we see it too, is that we're not out of the woods. You know, that just things can change very fast on us, and you know, depending on the administration, those sorts of things, in view of, you know, elected leaders that you know, change very often, that you know, those types of things can change very quickly on us. So yeah, that's a very good point, that we're not out of the woods. And you know, just to that point a little bit, make the comment that even though that, you know, regulatory things change over time with elected officials and their viewpoints, the thing that we don't see changing, at least right now, in fact we see increased pressure, is consumer and societal demands. The consumer votes with their pocketbook, and companies that are there to make money have got to listen to the consumer and be accustomed to, you know, their demands, and that's where we see the opportunity a little bit on this side, that if we can educate them better and give them the data that they want, that connects the field to the fridge essentially.
You just raised the consumer question. So consumers are paying more, for example, for organic certified commodities. Has Land O'Lakes looked at water quality certified commodity, and whether that could increase cost for a commodity and thereby maybe incentivize the producer to do more voluntary water quality work?
Yeah, very good question, and that's it. Yes, I mean that's an area that we've looked at, as well as a lot of companies. You know, at the end of the day, the challenge is you know, connecting that and having the data to connect to the consumer with that type of information. Technology is obviously in data. Our ability to capture data changes that, and is changing that faster than what we would have ever thought, you know, 5 or 10 years ago. So we do see some opportunities there when those things happen, or you know, what it looks like is really kind of the unique piece. So you know, at the end of the day, it's something that we think a lot of people in the industry are exploring, and how do we, you know, in a sense, find that area to bring back to the industry to make more impacts, you know, whether it be on edge of field practices or those sorts of things that are a little bit more challenging economical for the grower.
All right, now I've got a follow-up based on your answer. Is Land O'Lakes Sustain looking at all at the difference between the economic impact on the ag economy of regulation versus taking that same money and putting it into incentivizing practices like the edge of field practices, saturated buffers, bioreactors, impoundments, those sorts of things?
Sorry, I missed the first part of what you said there.
Well, are you looking at, I mean, there's obviously a cost to the ag economy to regulation, and that can actually have a drag on the national economy if that's not handled properly. Has anyone looked at taking that same cost and just investing it in incentivizing those edge of field practices?
Yeah, I don't know that directly we've investigated that, but we've got a team that looks at, you know, what are ways that we can bring, you know, ways to positively impact water quality, those sorts of things, and probably looking at a whole gamut of you know, ways to do that. So that one specifically, I'm not sure on, but yeah, just it's certainly in our mindset to find ways to make those positive impacts. You know, maybe not other ways than just the traditional government, you know, farm bill programs and those sorts of things. But we also know too that in some cases it might be challenging for growers to understand all of those farm bill programs. We're trying to work on bits and pieces of education, and you know, who's got the right fit, and you know, what's your goals over the next few years. If you know, if it leads to items that could possibly be cost share, let's hook those people up and get the process started.
Thanks for coming, Brian. Great presentation. My question goes to the capacity that Land O'Lakes CFS has to deliver cover crops and other services. So we have communities. So my question goes more toward drinking water areas, not surface water. So we have these drinking water areas that might be from 2 square miles up to a township. What might you envision what CFS or Land O'Lakes could do in those areas to reduce nitrogen loading to the drinking water?
Yeah, you know, in those cases, it's rapid adoption of practices that, you know, we know, and we've got research and science that promotes and shows the value that it can make towards positively impacting water quality. You know, there's a lot of people doing a lot of really good things. Farmers, again, when you go back to those 2 slides that I showed, the production story is incredible, and the technology that's been promoted within, you know, the whole industry. But, you know, adoption of various technologies and practices, those sorts of things, is where the ability to really change those, you know, and if we can promote higher adoption rates, that's where we're going to make the most impacts in those types of situations. But very localized efforts obviously are needed. We do that a lot of times in watersheds, like the Cedar River Watershed Partnership. When we can really hone in and add more resources in those local areas, and, you know, talk about the benefits and help along with those ag retailers, that's where we think the magic is. And you know, it's not always easy to do it on a broad scale, but when we drill it down to a narrower scale, that we can get more focus and localized there, and where we think we can make some really good impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we're right on time. A couple things that I forgot to mention in opening. We have a tech table set up in the back. If you have any questions, we'll have people sitting at that table. We also have a virtual reality booth set up with some drone footage of some water quality features that were put in, so if you have some time, do that. Remainder of the day, we have breakout sessions starting at 10:10, so we'll have a short break here. Like I said, those are upstairs. We have alternative side inlet calculator in room 245 and altered hydrology in 247. We'll end those right around 11, have a 10-minute break, and then 2 additional breakout sessions, drainage and soil health in room 245 and drainage authority planning and prioritization in 247. Then we'll have lunch here, networking lunch, and then I get the job of trying to keep you awake after lunch at 1 o'clock. In that time, we think about some questions. We have a panel at 2 o'clock talking about wetlands and tile. So we'll take a short break and then be ready at 10:10 upstairs.